This is a very special edition of Late Night Health. We're going to talk about health of the world. Right now, in my opinion, and I think many others, anti-Semitism is growing. It's becoming almost daily. You hear about problems with synagogues, temples, Jews in general being attacked. I wanted to take a lighter look at being Jewish. As I've said on the show, I am Jewish. I'm very proud of that. We have a very special young woman, a young rabbi, on our show. Her name is Miriam Udel. She's got a new book out, and it's actually hanging in between us right now, but it's called Honey on the Page. I love the book and the stories. Rabbi Miriam, welcome to Late Night Health.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's really a pleasure to be with you and your listeners.
I'm really curious. Why is Judaism important to you?
Well, it's the matrix in which the rest of my life makes sense. It is a set of stories that I know best. It's a set of relationships. It's a lot of sensory information, foods, smells, feelings. And it's just, a really essential part of who I am and what I hope to pass down to my children.
I'm going to use a word here, from, which means religious, if I'm not mistaken. Were you raised in a religious home?
So I don't think that anybody would say that I was raised frum, which, yes, is the Yiddish term for pious, although I was raised in a religiously engaged Jewish household. My parents decided to keep kosher when they got married, so keeping kosher has always been part of my life. Observing a Sabbath rest is something that I became committed to when I was in high school. And I was the kind of kid who would go to Sunday school, go to Hebrew school, and always had more questions and wanted more to read and just wanted more exposure and answers. And when I started learning Jewish languages, first Hebrew and then eventually Yiddish, that was really my pathway to finding out where the more was.
In your own life, and you look out, a lot of religions are gaining people. Judaism is diminishing in general. I mean, we're less than 2% of the world's population, right? And
so,
I want to keep it alive, and this book will do that.
Well, the thing is that our identity, as described in our own classical literature, has always been that of a small group, a small tribe. And it's not, we don't proselytize. We're not hoping to gain new adherents. And it's always been the case that we're more concerned with the quality and the richness of the spiritual lives that we're able to construct for ourselves than we are with the precise number of adherents. And that's no different today about Judaism as a whole. But I would say that with Yiddish in particular, which is the language of Eastern European Jewry that started to be spoken in the area between the Rhine and the Rhone rivers in what is now Germany around the turn of the millennium, around the year 1000, and continued to flourish and spread out and move eastward with the Jewish people over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, and then went global through processes of Jewish migration to every continent. Yiddish itself, I'm often asked, is it a dying language? And I like to say, yes, Yiddish has been a dying language through its entire modern period, but fortunately, it is accustomed to attending its own funeral and sort of sitting in the back pew and laughing at its own funeral, because there's always this fear about its dying out. What about transmission? But Yiddish is a good bet. You can bet on Yiddish.
And there are actually Yiddish language programs online that you can take. I've tried, and it's amazing. I don't know if you got the music that I sent to our mutual friend Javier. Did you get that little video? No?
I'm not sure that I saw that.
It's
been
Yiddish.
A busy week with Passover prep, so I might have missed an email.
It was, I think we sent it a week ago. It was This Land Is Your Land in Yiddish.
In Yiddish, I love that. I heard
and
that.
it was, I've listened to it like 10 times.
Yeah.
I don't speak a word, but it just resonates with me. Yeah. Let's talk about fairy tales. Before we started, I mentioned that the actual Grimm's fairy tales are grim.
Yeah.
I mean, they beheadings and killings and blood, and they were quite something. Is Honey on the Page for kids or for adults or for both?
So it's yes, yes, and yes. I love talking about the Grimm's fairy tales, and I actually teach a course on children's literature where we read Grimm, and then we read some of this Yiddish material that I've translated. And the reason that I like to bring in Grimm is because their original project was not writing for children. Their original project was collecting and recording the authentic folk materials of the German people. And they took it on as a project of kind of ethnic nationalism to define their people's stories. And the Grimm's fairy tales underwent 7 revisions and editions between 1812 and I think 1857. And with each revision, they toned down any kind of sexual content, particularly outside of marriage, and they bumped up the violence because they actually thought that made it more fun and more readable for children, which is all to say that our sense of what's appropriate for children really changes over time. And most of these Yiddish stories that I translate were written in the 1920s and 1930s. Some of them date from after World War II and go till the 1970s, but they were written also as a project of cultural nationalism. In this case, the culture was Yiddish, and there was a desire to preserve Yiddish and transmit it to the next generation. And what's so special about these stories, one of the things that's special about them, is that they were composed at a moment when we already had fairly modern ideas about child psychology and about what was suitable for child readers. So most of these stories do not have the kind of what we would consider gratuitous violence that we see in the Grimm's tales, but they are frank about discussing violence against the Jewish community, whether it's a fairy tale that includes a blood libel as a plot point or a historical novella about the Spanish Inquisition that's actually published during the Holocaust and is a kind of indirect way of talking to young readers about the violence of the Holocaust. So I think that it's a book best enjoyed by children and adults in proximity to one another. It might be that a child is old enough to read it independently and then talk about it over a meal with a loving adult. Or it might be that for some of the lighter stories, the adult is reading directly to a child who's not yet an independent reader.
I've been enjoying the stories light and dark equally as well. I also like the fact that you give a brief biography of each of the authors. And I found that fascinating. People coming from Russia and Germany to the United States sometimes as writers. I also think of Shalom Aleichem, whose most famous work, of course, became Fiddler on the Roof. Tevye the Milkman. Is there any comparison between what you've collected.
Yeah.
And his work?
So Shalom Aleichem is actually the first person who is remembered in connection with Yiddish children's literature. He did not write directly for children. That wasn't such an idea during most of his career, and there wasn't perceived to be a market for it. But the project of Yiddish children's literature really grows out of Jewish leftist politics, both in Europe and in the Americas, particularly in New York, and the founding of Yiddish schools and after schools. And these educational leaders who were founding these schools looked around and said, okay, what are the kids going to read? Well, you know what? Sholem Aleichem wrote a lot of stories about children, about childhood. Many of them are first-person narrators looking back at some incident from childhood, often related to some kind of mischief around one of the Jewish holidays. And they figured we can take those stories and we can cut out the boring parts about economic injustice, and we can add a glossary at the end, and boom, those will be our first children's stories. And that's what they did. So Sholem Aleichem was really the first person to kind of fill that emerging gap before people started writing specifically for Yiddish-speaking children in the 19-teens and 20s.
How did you decide to resurrect these? Were these stories told to you as a child?
They were not a single one of them. I started working on this material in 2013. I was teaching Yiddish language at the beginner level pretty frequently at Emory, where I still teach. And I had two young children.
I have to enroll then.
I wish you would audit. Now everything is online. You would be welcome to tune in. But I had two young children of my own. And it was really the convergence of my work as a Yiddish language instructor and my vocation as a mother that made me wonder, was anything ever written for children in Yiddish? And when I started looking into it, I found that there was actually an embarrassment of riches. Not only did we have nearly 1,000 freestanding books, picture books, storybooks, anthologies, and a whole set of periodicals, some of which ran for decades, but that most of those books had even been digitized and were sitting there on the website of the Yiddish Book Center, and very little was being done with them, particularly for the English language reader. There are some scholars in Israel and in Europe who've taken up this material, but I didn't really see much of anything going on in English. And I thought, these stories have got to get out to the world. Some of them have got to be good. And I started reading, and not all of them have aged well, but some of them are absolute gems. And somebody had to start translating them. And I figured, why not me?
Why not? I'm going to have you read a passage in a moment or two. How did your boys and your family react to this? I mean, you started in 2013. It's been 8 years plus coming.
Yes. So the book is dedicated to my three sons, and they love that they have a book dedicated to them that they can read, because my first book, scholarly monograph on Yiddish modernism, they're not really ready to read yet. So they love them.
I don't think I am either. You got to be a scholar for that one.
It's more user friendly than you think, but the 5-year-old, it's on the night table, and we read to it. My husband often does bedtime with him, and he reads the stories very frequently, and the 5-year-old loves them. So it feels really good to have been able to produce something that my own children could enjoy.
That's terrific. Let's ask you to read a story for us, if you don't mind.
Sure. So let me set up a little bit of context. I'm going to read a passage from a story by Yankov Pat, who was an educator and a school administrator from originally born in Bialystok, and he was one of the most fortunate men of the 20th century because he came as the secretary of the Central Yiddish Schools Commission in Vilna, in Vilnius, Lithuania. He came on a fundraising trip to New York in 1938, and he saw what was happening in Europe, and he decided to stay for a while. And he was able to bring over a lot of teachers and cultural workers from the Yiddish school system to Safe Harbor in New York. And he also did a lot of memorialization work after the war. And he wrote a story called The Magic Lion about a rabbi who needs to go on a journey through an unnamed desert, a very important journey that's going to take 12 days. And so there is no question about the fact that he's going to be traveling over the course of at least one Sabbath. And he's traveling with a caravan for safety. And he contracts with one member of the caravan that that man will stay with him and rest throughout the Sabbath when it's prohibited for him to be traveling, to be riding on a camel. And at the last minute, that gentleman decides to back out. He wants to go on with the rest of the group. And the rabbi is left with the decision about whether he's going to continue with the group or put down his pack and observe the Sabbath in the way that he is accustomed to do. And he decides that he's going to just put his faith in God and put down the pack, come what may. And so he's made that decision and he's praying. And I'm going to pick up with a very lyrical, beautiful passage about the natural world before I get into the action. As with every dusk, one side of the sky, the western side, glowed a wonderful red, and the sun set in a golden sea and withdrew itself into night, while on the eastern side of the sky, the darkness was heavy with lonesome shadows. From the east blew an evening wind that wafted the night clouds around the sky. The rabbi stood facing the dark east and recited the evening prayers alone in the wilderness. He prayed out loud with his whole heart, and the louder he prayed, the calmer and safer he felt, secure in the knowledge that nothing bad would happen to him in the wilderness. After he finished his prayers, he took out 2 loaves of challah from his pack and recited aloud the Kiddush blessing over them. Then he recited Hamoitzi, the blessing over bread, and tasted the challah and continued to take bites in between singing the traditional Friday night zmiris. He was so engrossed that he didn't notice his surroundings. He didn't see a lion approaching from the edge of the wilderness, a real terrifying lion, the king of the jungle, taking long, quick lion steps right over to the rabbi. Only when he looked up did he make out in the darkness of the Sabbath night the flash of the lion's eyes, and by then the beast was standing right in front of him.
Wow.
Well, pause there.
That's, I mean, words in general tell stories. I mean, they're, radio, which we also do here at Late Night Health, it's theater of the mind. I saw this man by himself in the lion. Very nice. In our remaining couple of moments, the book of course is called Honey on a Page, on the Page, and it's a treasury of Yiddish children's literature. This is a holiday time, and I thought it was appropriate. And we'll have this up during the holiday time sometime. It's Passover, Pesach, and I really appreciate the book. It's terrific, and it resonates as I've said. Any last thoughts about Yiddish Jewish culture in the 21st century?
Sure. So one of my favorite reviews of the book. It was just a small capsule review by Marjorie Engel, who writes a lot about children's literature, both Jewish and general readership. And she said something about how the book helps to explain why Yiddish has become cool again for young people. That you really get a sense of the vibrancy that this culture created for its youth 100 years ago, and the way that that can speak to our children, and not only our children, but can be enjoyed by several generations together today. So I hope that, people will check it out and really see that, in the same way that the title alludes to this tradition of smearing honey on the first pages of a child's alphabet primer and having the child lick it up and sweeten their learning, that this book will sweeten the process of learning more about Jewish culture.
And that's for everybody, right? It's
absolutely.
I think it's important that we know about our neighbors.
These are human stories.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. Rabbi Miriam, thank you very much for joining us. Hold on here. I'm Mark Allen. This is Late Night Health. If you want the book, I've got a website there for you, and you can visit that. It's also on Amazon, I would assume.
Yes, anywhere right? That books are sold.
Anywhere that books are sold. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for watching. I'm Mark Allen. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye for now.